Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. The policy issue in discussion today is climate cooperation between India and China, two of the world's largest emitters. So, climate cooperation between India and China, as evidenced by past instances, has significant potential. And that is largely because they share a common interest in addressing climate change without compromising on their economic growth. Or what we also call climate realism, right? In fact, we have seen China adopt an approach to clean technology that has enabled its economic growth, more so positioned it at the center of global energy transition. And despite these overlapping interests and commonality in the challenges faced, cooperation in addressing climate change and clean technologies has been stalled due to geopolitical tensions between the two countries. So, to discuss on how we can move forward on this agenda and the possibility of meaningful climate cooperation alongside persistent geopolitical tensions, I have with me two wonderful guests, Pooja Ramamurthy and Shruti Jargad from the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Welcome to the episode, Pooja and Shruti.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Pooja and Shruti, before I pose my first question to you, I just came across your paper on framing India's strategy on climate and clean energy cooperation with China, right? And I think it had some really interesting insights on how India can navigate its dependence on Chinese green supply chains. While addressing the common climate adaptation issues that we have. So, could you briefly highlight two key takeaways from the paper on why India needs a strategy on climate cooperation with China and what such a strategy might look like within this context?
So, thank you so much for having us on this podcast. So, yeah, the paper we wrote has actually been a labor of love between Shruti and me for the past year and a half. Where actually, when we started even thinking about this, India and China were not, as you yourself mentioned, had very limited diplomatic engagement. As the paper has progressed, at the same time, we've also seen India and China's engagement kind of, getting better as well. So I think this reflects that. But I think the two big takeaways is that, that on the topic of climate and energy, particularly which involves two big issues, one around energy transitions and the second around climate adaptation and resilience. Both these countries face major challenges. As you yourself said, China has become the dominant player, not only to India, but also in the world. It has a monopoly now on most green goods, but not only on green goods, but also kind of on the components and the materials, which are supplied. And that's the same case for India. India has a really ambitious net zero transition by 2070. And even though India and China, they did not have much diplomatic engagement over the past couple of years, we still saw that the trade was going on, as usual. And India was importing larger and larger volumes of green goods and critical minerals from China. So this essentially shows that it is not possible for India to ignore China, because the trade deficit is getting higher, and India does need kind of to engage in the short and medium term. Does need to engage. Secondly, on the Chinese side, we also see, and Shruti will speak more about this, I'm sure, that there is a very aggressive competition between Chinese companies as well. There's a lot of overcapacity of green goods, and they need a market for this as well. So they can't ignore India at the same time. Like India is one of their largest trade partners, so they can't ignore India either. So I think the point I'm trying to say is that, India and China do need to engage on climate, but this and on clean energy, but this engagement needs to go beyond just trade. So because this is also becoming like a matter of geopolitical friction as trade deficits go up. Secondly, I think though that the next key takeaway is that given the persistent tensions, This will have to be a very cautious reopening. It cannot be that India and China suddenly, start engaging on all topics all at once. There is still a trust deficit, and so trust needs to be built between both countries. And so, in our paper, we kind of show that in sectors that are very geopolitically strategic, and are economically competitive, such engagement may be a little tough at the moment, but they are low hanging fruit, such as, governance exchanges, knowledge exchanges on issues such as carbon markets, waste to energy, energy efficiency, climate adaptation, urban governance. So there are a lot of low hanging fruits that both the countries can engage in. I mean, every time in Delhi, when we have kind of an air pollution episode, you see that the Chinese embassy actually reaches out and said, like, we are happy to assist our Indian colleagues in dealing with the challenge that we dealt with a couple of years ago, right? So it's not like engagement is impossible. It's just that those key sectors have to be identified, which don't create larger tensions between the two. I think right now is the best time to be speaking about this because, last month or in April, we saw kind of the Chinese climate envoy who came and visited in India, and a lot of the topics that we bring up as well were spoken about then. So I hope that this paper leads, to more openings for where India and China can engage.
Absolutely, Pooja. I agree with you on the context, as you said, right? This engagement seems difficult. I think there are low hanging fruits, as we will discuss those in the coming questions. So I just wanted to zoom out a little first and look at the wider approaches that these countries take towards climate adaptation and clean technologies, right? Because we know that China looks at it more with the lens of an economic opportunity, especially when it comes to clean technologies. But if you could just help us identify and compare the two countries' approaches to climate adaptation and clean energy transitions, and how do these differences shape their respective strategies in global climate diplomacy?
I think there are two very different stages that India and China are at in their approach to climate change and energy being part of their industrial policy, their economic policy. In China, there is a greater degree of integration that one sees between how energy and climate are being looked at. So, this is something that I've talked about before also, but you see three different categories or three different ways in which China is looking at climate and energy. One thing is that it has become carbon peaking and carbon neutrality has become part of the top political leadership's goal. And that political signaling really helps in also in terms of setting targets for the bureaucrats. So that energy and climate and environment component has become part of the political activity that is happening. The second thing is, apart from being a priority area in the politics of China, it is also a priority area in the economics, where, as you rightly mentioned, the new energy system is one of the newer drivers of economic growth. And how the infrastructure, which China has a substantial degree of, how that has to be industrial infrastructures to be modernized. New energy is again part of that. Then the third component is the international component of it, where because of US's withdrawal, can China take a leadership position in climate change and climate cooperation? That is the diplomatic component. Then there is the security component of it, where China is heavily reliant on energy imports. And so clean energy becomes a way to mitigate that reliance, to get rid of that reliance. And stockpiling, again, is one of the ways that China's trying to mitigate. The second component of this international and national security understanding is, how does China build dominance in green technologies? China is an exporter of these technologies, is an exporter of these goods, and so that gives leverage in foreign policy. Now, in all of this, therefore, from what I'm understanding here is that while the focus started with more pressure on the Chinese government to get rid of the harmful effects of industrialization. Initially, the focus is more on environment and providing clean air. And from that, the target becomes carbon neutrality. But now I think the focus is more on the industrial component of it, that how does China engage with the rest of the world in providing or in becoming a supplier of these goods. And therefore, we are seeing more activity that China is doing in terms of providing clean energy infrastructure through its BRI projects. In South Asia, it's one of the major activities that has emerged. On the other hand, India, I think, at least on the international, while there are goals, so for example, Solar Mission, the International Solar Alliance, I see less of integration between our economic goals, where we are also trying to industrialize, increase our manufacturing capacity in a host of other goods, and at the same time try to achieve these goals. But I'm sure Pooja will be able to add more on this.
I think if you go back to the larger national strategy, I think both India and China have ambitious climate and energy goals. I don't think there's a difference in that. Both countries initially resistant, both countries during multilateral negotiations. I think at some point, especially post 2015, after the Paris Agreement, both countries definitely realized that they need to take climate and energy seriously. And I think from the top leadership also, this has been reflected. I just think you need to look at the magnitude of things, right? Like China by 2014 had already become one of the world's largest per capita emitters. It had already become one of the world's biggest, suppliers of goods of global supply chains. Whereas India has also very ambitious targets, but just the scale will be much smaller because, first of all, we don't have that big a manufacturing base. We don't have as large of energy or electricity demand. So in that sense, if you look at the gigawatts installed, of course, China surpasses us completely. But if you actually look at the share of energy into the grid, I think in China, solar and wind give 22%. I think in India, it's something like 17% into the grid. So you can see that it's not that large a difference between India and China. It's just you have to understand the magnitudes of scale of what we're dealing with, in terms of the energy needs and the energy capacity that is being installed. Something that China did when it started approaching its clean energy, and this is not only in comparison to India, I think this is in comparison globally, is that it started understanding, as Shruti said, the economic need to manufacture these green goods, right? And it really, really succeeded in that across the value chain. So usually when you see global value chains, some might be involved in the material, some might be involved in the final product, some might be involved in the midstream. But China, when it comes to green components, has really managed to go from every part of the value chain, from owning mines to extracting to processing the materials to creating the technology, and to finally going on to sell the final component. And this foresight India unfortunately did not have in the past to create this extensive. There was a lot of make in India talk. There was renewable energy often sold in the same way as the same economic good that India also has to do make in India for clean energy, because it'll be green jobs, it'll get more, there'll be a lot more to the economy. But we were not able, unfortunately, due to a number of reasons, which maybe an industrial economist can speak more about, but we were not able to get the same amount of manufacturing capacity or the material processing capacity as China. But right now we are trying to catch up. So even if you see, when it comes to renewable energy, our dependence on China, for example, solar imports, just a couple of years ago in like 2020, 2021 was up to 92%.
Right.
Now those have fallen. It has fallen to like 56%. Part of this is due to two things. One is our diversification of supply chains, and the other thing is also because we have managed to build a lot of domestic capacity. It's just that it's not going at the pace that we would like to, and we are I mean, there are two caveats to this. One is that a lot of imports do come from countries such as Vietnam and Malaysia, which may be the middle, which may be actually just serving as a conduit for Chinese goods.
Yeah.
And the second thing is that there is actually, at the end of the day, even if we have reduced imports in certain solar components, essentially the end material does come, the critical minerals does come from China. So we are grappling with these dual issues, but I do think we are improving on reducing our national dependence. It's just that, which is why I said I don't think the situation is going to be the same in the long term, but at least in the short term, there will have to be engagement with China. In terms of adaptation as well, I mean, India was one of the countries that has had the most ambitious adaptation plans back in the day. I mean, when we had NAPCC, a lot of people, there is a lot of debate within the community, oh, should we have one central climate change node, or is it, because right now the NAPCC is spread across so many ministries. But I actually think it's good. If every ministry integrates climate change into their agenda, that works out better in my mind than having one central person in charge of clean energy. But if you see, even back then, gender, agriculture, water, food security, everything was in, I mean, rural, urban, every issue was included under climate adaptation. Again, it's just that we, due to again structural and institutional issues, I would say we haven't been able to achieve those goals. So, so while the leadership, while the policy is all there, equal, matching, I would say, even China's ambition, China has just been much better at implementing it on ground than we have. So I think that is the key. So I think the approaches are both similar. I just think operationalizing it, China has just been better than India has been. And, and I'm sure you work on India, China, on other issues as well. I'm sure you will see a similar pattern in that as well, where India has very ambitious goals, has all the policies in place. It's just that on the ground, it's not been able to take that off as as well as it should have.
No, that's right. So I think these differences in scale and capacities for implementation are something to keep in mind when it comes to the differences. But I was just recently working on energy security amidst the Iran war, and I was looking at how China has been able to sort of hold up during the energy shock. So I think it is a result of their implementation, where the renewable energy integration, and not just the integration through their massive projects, but also diversifying their end consumption in terms of uses of increased use of electric vehicles, and amongst other things. I think that has been really instrumental in sort of shielding the Chinese economy from this energy shock. But on the other hand, we see India, which is again completely reliant on imported fossil fuels, and we're yet to sort of reach that point where our end use consumption energy mix is quite diversified, right?
Yeah, I think if I may come in here, I mean, so no, India also wants to diversify its end use. It's just that then we will not be dealing with the imports of fossil fuels from, fossil fuel countries. We are dealing with imports of Chinese or, whatever, Southeast Asian goods. So it's again not that we don't have that same goal to diversify. It's just that then again, you have energy sovereignty coming in, where you say, okay, if I diversify into EVs, then where are we getting the components for the EVs? Again, imported, right? And we do see cases such as when there was a rare earth magnet curb where India was unaffected, where, I even read an article where it said that Bajaj two-wheelers was actually thinking of cutting down its production by half when that rare earth magnet issue was going on. So it's not again that we don't have those goals. It's just that again, because we don't have the manufacturing capacity, we then become import dependent again, and then that becomes another problem. So you're dealing with, it's kind of like a vicious cycle almost.
Yeah, it's a matter of planning ahead and avoiding shifting your dependencies from one source to another. But yes, speaking of commonalities here, I was also reading about how India and China were once closely aligned on principles such as common but differentiated responsibilities, and there was a phase of relatively strong cooperation between the two countries, especially on climate adaptation, right? Particularly before, I think, 2015. We've also seen instances of subnational cooperation through several sister agreements as well. So, could you also walk us through the trajectory of that cooperation and what were its key outcomes and which areas sort of saw the most meaningful collaboration before, of course, relations began to deteriorate?
So one thing I think to note, and we at our workshop as well, we had a Chinese official here, is that the multilateral is still actually going on quite okay. It has, I would not say there's been a breakdown at the multilateral level. There might be diverging interests, with China taking much more responsibility and willing to take up a stronger climate leadership position than India, is. But I don't say that there's been a breakdown at the multilateral level, because even if you see during COP, which was in Glasgow, there was a whole phase out of coal versus phase down. It is the Chinese and Indians who sat and pushed back to the to the global north, saying we're going to phase out, not phase down. So I mean, and 21, 22, I mean, that phase was actually the one where the worst bilateral engagement was going on, right? We had border skirmishes and things like that. So you can see, even in the worst bilateral geopolitical frictions, multilateral engagement, especially around climate and energy, has been going on even today. So I will not say that there's been a deterioration of multilateralism. I think there may be some amount of diverging interests, which is with China even willing to sometimes say things like, and which we have seen in action, willing to fund, willing to provide climate finance to the global south, willing to kind of take up a mantle of, we will help global south countries to achieve their needs, etc., which India does as well. But again, the scale we spoke about. India also has International Solar Alliance. We have the CDRI. But the extent to which, as Shruti mentioned, that BRI projects are meeting kind of financial and infrastructure needs on clean energy and other sustainability issues across the global south is something India has not been able to achieve yet. So in that sense, I mean, I wouldn't say that. I would say, though, that some of the key outcomes have definitely been the CBDR, as you mentioned. Other ones were also around the energy transition itself, saying that, we do need just energy transitions. We are countries that are still quite dependent on coal. And, like that phase out will take some time. A lot around the loss and damage fund. So I think in Egypt as well, a lot around loss and damage, with both India and China have constantly backed, a more need to have kind of global South representation. I mean, even if you go beyond COP, if you see, within the multilateral banks, etc., both countries have called for kind of reforms to around how finance is branded and given to countries, especially in adaptation time. So I think there is still a lot of possibilities still. I mean, now, so I recently heard from Chinese colleagues and Indian colleagues that, stances around CBAM, so even globally, that India and China should kind of have common stances around CBAM, because both the countries are going to be, are going to be affected by it. So there is, at the multilateral platform, at the end of the day, India and China have a lot of interests. I just think that it's the bilateral now which needs to be figured out. I think whenever we speak to both Indian and Chinese diplomats at multilaterals, they say we have absolutely no problems communicating, have a lot of common interests, have a often take the same stances. At one point, I think this is way earlier in the 1990s. Often India used to be the voice that even China used to back. When Indian experts used to kind of make opinions, and then the Chinese experts would say, okay, whatever you say, like, we'll agree with you because, we have the same position. I don't think we're there where India is now the leading voice in the climate. I think China is trying to be the leading voice in the climate, but I don't think there'll be a state where they'll say, no, we won't agree when we have to go to the negotiating table with the global north, because I think that interest is still there, that we have to, we are the world's two largest countries, and and of the global south as well, we are the two largest voices. So in all these multilaterals, we need to have a joint voice. I think that is clear. Shruti, do you have anything else to add?
Shruti, perhaps you would like to chip in from the trends that you have identified in past cooperation, as well as examples of other countries that have managed to engage China despite their conflicting interests. So, what do you think would be the way forward, especially when it comes to the sectors that are most feasible for this bilateral cooperation?
Right. So before I answer this question about what sectors are feasible, I think we just need to take a step back and understand what past cooperation, or at least attempts at cooperation, show us. And so in the historical mapping that we have done for our paper, we find that it's been very active. It's been a period of between 1993 and 2015. It has been a period of active engagement, and the areas of engagement are very broad. They range from environmental conservation, which we found to be the most talked about topic between these two countries, to even ocean and marine biology. They were talking about climate negotiations at the international stage, but also about energy and renewable energy, both in these two countries, as well as even partnering up and getting into joint agreements for third countries. So there is a history of cooperation, and there is organizational memory of dealing with organizations and institutions within each country. Um, and what I mean by organizational memory here is that NDRC and NDRC was continuously in communication with the Planning Commission, and so, for instance, having six. Was it six or five strategic economic dialogues, and where they are repeatedly talking about similar issues and constantly keeping until the last, I think, strategic economic dialogue, they were even talking about hydrogen and newer forms of energy. So there is that institutional memory of communicating. There is a broad range of issues. And then the channels of climate cooperation were also very extensive. So, and these channels are at the government level, they are also at the level of the scientific community, and at the level of business. So, all of these three different agencies are involved. In the government level, we are talking about exchange of policy ideas, exchange of so parliamentarians or ministerial visits to each other countries, bureaucratic exchanges. We are talking at scientific level. These MOUs mention that scientists do residency in each other's technical universities. We are talking about sharing of R&D facilities, sharing of joint authorship of research papers. So at the business level, again, there's talk of business development. And as you yourself mentioned, sister city agreements between not just major cities like Delhi and Beijing, but we're also talking about Chennai, and then we're talking about Chongqing, we're talking about Hyderabad and Dunhuang. So there is what we found was that there was an extensive amount of exchange or planned exchange, ranging from the topmost level, where joint statements on climate cooperation are specifically being issued. It's a topic of discussion on summit level visits, to the sister city agreements and subnational level. What we found through our interviews was, again, implementation wasn't either. There can be two cases: either a lot of implementation is happening and there is no follow-up mechanism that is taking care of it, because many of these joint agreements, they expired in 2015 but were never renewed. If some of them were automatically renewing and ongoing, there is no follow-up mechanism. So that's a big problem, or at least we did not come across any in our interviews or research. And so it's very difficult to say that what was the outcome of these exchanges. I think one very visible or successful one was the river water or hydrological data sharing, which went on until I think 2020 or 21. But when that agreement, that MOU, expired at a very critical moment, that's when the geopolitical tensions begin. And we did not find a renewal of that particular hydrological data sharing agreement, which was quite successful. So, yeah, given that is the past trajectory. One of the things that we are, and again, we can continue talking about the other measures. One of the things that we are suggesting is that apart from what Pooja mentioned, that you have to differentiate between things that are geopolitically sensitive and, I mean, economically competitive and geopolitically strategic, you have to think about things that are low hanging. And one avenue of cooperation is that urban resilience and how cities are managed, so air pollution, um, waste to energy. This has been one of the key issues of discussion in the past, and we think that this can be another opening that we have, where we're talking about these smaller, narrower issues, but our channels of how they're implemented have to expand. So instead of just looking at national level governments, we have to look at provincial and state level governments, city level governments, local bureaucracies, and how they can exchange governance mechanisms, they can exchange what kind of data can be shared. Yes, so broadening the avenues, channels, but um, making issues very, very specific. That would be our way forward.
Right. No. Yeah, I think that's great that we engage in very issue specific and sort of moving away from domains like clean technologies where we've already seen so much contestation, right? So, and my next question also follows from this, that from your perspective, where do you think the Chinese interests lie when it comes to climate and clean energy cooperation with India? Because I think to really see meaningful collaboration between the two countries, there has to be some willingness from Beijing as well, right? And especially considering the recent cases like where they've tried to restrict technology transfer in battery manufacturing technologies, and we've also seen Beijing raise the WTO complaints for against India's PLIs in our own green technology ecosystems. But again, as you said, when we speak about issue-specific cooperation, right, where do you think and how willing do you think Beijing is likely to be in advancing such cooperation?
Right. So, one thing to understand here is, and this is a question that we've been dealing with since the very beginning. And people have been asking, okay, what does India have to offer to China in this case? And what makes India an attractive partner for China? I think there are two issues here. One is that in the last few years, especially since this whole US China trade war has started, diplomacy has become a very transactional kind of an activity. It has always been, but it has become more about, oh, everybody has to be 50-50 here. And one of the things that in our discussions with government officials, especially diplomats, is that it's never going to be 50-50. It keeps changing. There's a push and pull. And bilaterally, there is this push and pull that keeps happening. And the second thing is what is the international situation that also affects how India and China are going to approach each other. So in this context, as Pooja mentioned before, one thing is that India is a very, very lucrative market. At the end of the day, there is an economic component to it where there are Chinese companies that want to invest in India, that want to at least sell in India. Now, it is to a large extent, it also matters on how the Indian side is dealing with these things. What are the things that we can negotiate on and put in the system that, okay, put in the agreement that if cars are to be sold here, then this is the price that you can sell them at. This is the manufacturing that has to happen. So, therefore, it's very important for India to examine this more and more from an economic security point of view, that these are our red lines, these are the demands, and this is how we're going to negotiate on each specific economic issue. Second thing is that India has a strong history of diplomacy. It has diplomacy is one of India's strengths, and China is, while its diplomatic heft is increasing in a lot of international organizations, there is still a lot that China needs India's support for. India being a major power that is not part of the Western alliance and an important player in the global south. So if China seeks to increase its diplomatic heft, become a leader, so-called leader of the global south, and tries to push forward an agenda that is not similar to a US-led agenda, there is little that can be achieved without having India on board. So, from economic perspective as well as diplomatic perspective, I think there is much that India has to offer. Yeah.
Pooja, would you like to add something to this and also maybe give us some closing remarks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that today, I don't think that either India or China can afford to ignore each other, either at, as Shruti said, at multilaterals due to credibility and issues such as that. There is still interest from the even though as we previously said that China does have much larger scale, much larger pockets, much larger capacity. There is still interest from the global south for India to get involved because no country wants to be in the hegemony of another single development partner. That's not of interest. It is also of interest of global south countries to kind of diversify as well as kind of leverage these partnerships. So India still does have a very important role to play. And but at the same time, I don't think India and China right now should be doing it only in parallel, but should also be trying to work together on a lot of these issues, because if we see that right now, at least around climate and clean energy, the global north is not taking the lead. There doesn't seem to be either from the US or from EU much interest in taking up climate leadership. Of course, the EU is still has ambitious climate goals, but even those are kind of backsliding a little bit if you see in many countries. And similarly with the US, the story is, just of lack of interest completely with the new administration. And even if the Democratic administration comes back, I'm not sure how much, climate change will be on top of the agenda given all the other issues. So I think that we have come to a state where I think that is what has pushed both India and China to realize that they cannot ignore each other. There is some merit in working together, even if, and Shruti mentioned the hydrological agreement. So even if you see in the latest meeting, even though it was around the border issues, I think there was some mention by the Indian officials on how they would like to start having renewed conversations along the hydrological, the agreements that previously existed, how they would like to take that up as well. So slowly, as I said, cautiously, there is going to be an opening. There needs to be dialogue and conversation. One thing is, though, it doesn't need to be only G2G like earlier. So what Shruti and I mapped was mainly, national state-led engagement. A lot of the agreements were happening. A lot of the agreements did mention academics, they mentioned business personnel, but I don't know how much of that actually happened on ground, right? But today, I think with clean energy, with tech, a lot of the engagement will be with the private sector, because they have the Indian private sector kind of has the most to gain. If they want to start a joint venture on clean tech, on minerals, a Chinese partner would be good. But the only issue is that within India, there is not much. The Chinese don't have that much confidence that the Indian market will be, stable. Like tomorrow, again, if the geopolitical frictions, and then again, the Chinese company has to leave, or as we saw in the JV between SAIC and JSW, we saw that, then suddenly the JSW had to take over, and that caused a lot of frictions. So, if the Indian government needs to encourage that kind of Chinese investments and Chinese technology transfer, joint ventures, they will have to be a little more inward thinking within India on how to do that. Recently, there was some relaxation of the Press Note 3. But again, when I'm speaking to internally with the people, I find out that even though the government has relaxed, there is still some fear or apprehension within the system to accept Chinese investments, again, because they don't know whether tomorrow there will be a U-turn. So that is why, I mean, so those are all the longer term goals. Those things have to be worked out. We need to understand how to get the private sector involved, but then what the government can do to kind of, send the signal that, now there is more stability for these investments. But in the short term, I think a lot of the kind of angles and the kind of aspects that we have covered of where engagement is possible, I think that is the next step. Because even if you do a trend analysis of kind of the data set that Shruti and I built on kind of climate engagements and agreements, you'll see that in the beginning also it was nascent, it was slow. They were like certain sector-wise agreements, and then later on, as Shruti said, around the late 2000s till 2015 is kind of when agreements started becoming more ambitious. It's not like it just started ambitious. It started sector-wise, cautiously, slowly, and then it became bigger. And then, of course, because of other external things, that dropped off. So I think the same approach needs to start slow, start cautiously, work on certain sectors. So our colleagues from NUS and I, where we're doing this project together on the India-China climate collaboration, we are actually now coming out with a paper that is talking about certain sector-wise engagements. So, like what can actually be done in different sectors, which are more plausible, which kind of came out of two workshops, which we have been doing in Singapore, where we get both Indian and Chinese colleagues in the room to have conversations. So, yeah, so I think some of the last, I'll just end with some things. I think looking more at the future, we definitely need to understand what is the role of non-state actors, what private sector, but also scholars such as us, because we already have some track 2 dialogues with Indian and Chinese, but can we become more ambitious in this? Can we become track 1.5, etc.? And secondly, what can we learn from other nations who have similar asymmetries with China, but manage to have a kind of a better economic integration, at least. I won't, maybe not a diplomatic, but definitely better economic integration, such as our colleagues from the ASEAN, our colleagues from Japan. They still manage to have a strong economic integration. They still manage to have flows, technology and financial flows between these regions, while at the same time also having geopolitical tensions. So, what can we learn from these examples and how to engage with China in a way that we have guardrails? I think these are the two big things that need to be done, other than the third one I mentioned of more inward thinking of what can India actually do to enable kind of, more engagement, pragmatic engagement with its Chinese counterparts.
Thank you, Pooja. I think all of those were some really interesting insights on how we can move forward. And just to sort of sum it up a little, as you mentioned, right, more issue-specific, low-risk sort of engagements would be more helpful. And of course, going beyond national-level engagements, where we can also involve provincial and other subnational governments to sort of build more relations, and essentially picking up from where we left earlier. And I think the most important point that you mentioned towards the end was some regulatory consistency that the private sector needs from both India and China. And I think that is something that will really help in sort of picking up the pace in the green technology industry, right? So yes, thank you, Pooja, and thank you, Shruti, so much for joining in this episode and for sharing with us your insights. I hope the audience enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and stay tuned for the next episode.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.